71 people were killed, including dozens of women and children, in Israeli strikes after the deal was brokered last night. This will be tough. This morning, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accused Hamas of trying to change the terms. Hamas responded, accusing Netanyahu of looking for excuses not to implement the ceasefire.
While everyone in the media and our political leaders were celebrating yesterday, thinking that there was a done deal in regard to a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, it appears that Israel, as I suspected, has already delayed the vote to ratify the ceasefire deal, with Hamas and also, of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu using similar excuses to the excuses that he used back when other ceasefire deals fell apart. Now, it's not surprising that Israel has so far reneged on the ceasefire deal, even after the president of the United States held a press conference celebrating the ceasefire. Now, the cabinet in Israel is planning to meet on Friday in order to further debate and discuss the ceasefire deal. But at this point, things are incredibly wobbly. Now, let's get to some details, including what Netanyahu is claiming here. He claims that no, it's Hamas's fault. It's not our fault for reneging on the ceasefire deal. It looks like Hamas is trying to backtrack, but that's not the case. Hamas said that it was committed to the ceasefire agreement, which was announced by the mediators just yesterday. Then Netanyahu decided to change the story, change the cover story, if you will, and he argued that there were issues with the release of Palestinian prisoners. So let me just remind you all that since the beginning of this war, there have been literally thousands of Palestinian civilians, including women, children, civilian men, elderly people who have been placed on what's referred to as administrative detention. And administrative detention means that these individuals haven't been charged with anything. They're not being tried for anything. They're just, imagine being detained by authorities without any charges. That's what we're talking about here. And so there's been all of a sudden, all of this, all these protests in regard to what Hamas would get in exchange for agreeing to the ceasefire deal. And part of the agreement would require Israel to release Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Israeli hostages. Now, the argument here from the Israelis is that possibly some of the prisoners that Hamas would want Israel to release are prisoners who have carried out terror attacks against Israelis. But again, I just want to reiterate something that I've said recently, and that's the fact that this really has nothing to do with the terms of the deal. This has everything to do with the threats that are being made by the far right members of the Israeli cabinet, who are threatening to essentially cause political harm to Benjamin Netanyahu, which is his number one concern, his own political career and staying in power. So let's get to some of the details on that. The Financial Times had an excellent report on this, and Benjamin Netanyahu's office released a statement saying that Israel will not set a date for a cabinet and government meeting to approve the deal until the mediators announce that Hamas has approved all the details of the agreement. But they did approve all the details of the agreement. It is Israel that is now deciding to renege on the terms of this agreement. Israel said earlier on Thursday that Hamas was seeking to dictate which Palestinian prisoners would be released in exchange for Israeli hostages. Netanyahu's statement came as Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich's far-right religious Zionist party said on Thursday morning that it would leave the government if the deal led to a permanent end of the war. Then the party said later on Thursday that it was a condition for the party to remain in government and the coalition that Israel should resume fighting immediately upon the conclusion of the first phase of the deal. Now, in the first phase of the deal, it would last about 6 weeks. Fighting would stop for those 6 weeks and 33 hostages would be released by Hamas. Now, after those 6 weeks, negotiations would take place in regard to a permanent ceasefire. And so the argument by the far right members of the Israeli cabinet is that no, after the first phase, we just want to go back to war. We just want to keep fighting. We want to continue with the aerial bombardments. And I'm really not surprised by any of this. In fact, I cautioned everybody just yesterday when the celebratory nature of, of the press and our political leaders was very much apparent. And so I just want to remind you of what I was warning about while covering this story yesterday. Take a look. A lot needs to happen before this is finalized, but President Joe Biden, who really wants the ceasefire to be part of his legacy, has already done a press conference making it appear as though this is set in stone. And I think that's a big mistake. I am hoping that I'm proven wrong. But the idea that the Israeli government is going to sign on to the complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip, and the idea that Palestinians will be able to return to all parts of the Gaza Strip, including the north, just seems inconceivable to me. From what I've seen, all of the obstacles in place that could potentially dismantle this ceasefire deal are on the Israeli side. Okay, so before anyone gets too excited, you should know that these obstacles exist and they could play a role in basically ending the possibility of this particular ceasefire deal. The deal needs to be ratified by the Israeli cabinet. And as the New York Times reported, some hardline members of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government have voiced opposition to the deal. This has happened before. In fact, every time we think there's going to be a ceasefire deal accepted by the Israelis, they tend to renege. And it's because there are some extremists within the Israeli government, within the Israeli cabinet, who refuse to accept any ceasefire deal. And they brag about serving as obstacles to an end to this war. And that's exactly what happened here. So once it became apparent that Netanyahu was pretty much on board for the ceasefire, you start hearing the protests from the Ben Gvirs, Itamar Ben Gvir, the Bezalel Smotriches, the far right members of the Israeli cabinet. And they're threatening Netanyahu. And Netanyahu doesn't want to lose power. So as the Financial Times writes, while the ceasefire deal has enough support for ratification without this, lunatic far right signing on to it, fact of the matter is that if these far right members of the government essentially pull out of the government, thus doing away with the majority coalition Netanyahu would need to remain in power, well, then obviously Netanyahu's power would be under threat. And that's his number one concern. This is the problem with what's currently going on with these ceasefire negotiations. What we tend to forget about is that Benjamin Netanyahu has his own incentives, his own agenda, and his own incentives revolve around him remaining in power. The far right members of the Israeli cabinet know that, and they have used that as leverage in order to torpedo any ceasefire deal. And that's exactly what's happening right now. All of these arguments about oh no, Hamas hasn't agreed to the deal. Oh, actually they have agreed to the deal. So what now? Oh no, it's about the Philadelphia corridor and who's gonna control it. Oh no, it's really about the Palestinian prisoners and which ones we release. Aren't you supposed to have already negotiated all of this? Why are you now randomly changing the terms? Could it be because you're, looking for any excuse to not go through with the ceasefire in order to appease the far right members of the government? I believe that's what's really happening here. Now, as this whole game plays out, let's keep it real. The absolute carnage in the Gaza Strip continues. So after we heard the reports that there had been an agreement to a ceasefire, in those 24 hours since, 72 people have been killed in Gaza as a result of IDF airstrikes. Okay, so if you think anything has slowed down in regard to the carnage in Gaza, you would be mistaken. And I want to talk just briefly about the celebrations that came from both political parties yesterday, because while President Joe Biden wanted the ceasefire deal to be part of his legacy, and while he wanted to celebrate that in the form of a press conference yesterday, that absolutely was far too premature, if you ask me. There was no reason to believe that Israel wasn't going to renege like they typically do. And that's exactly what seems to have happened here. And then you also had Donald Trump, coming out of the gate, giving himself credit for succeeding in getting Israel and Hamas to accept a ceasefire deal. Now, let's say that the ceasefire deal went through. I do think Trump would certainly deserve some credit because he and his envoy to the Middle East were involved in this. And so Trump has repeatedly warned that there will be all hell to pay if the hostages are not released by January 20th. The ceasefire is supposed to come into effect and the first hostages released on Sunday. Now we don't know if that's going to happen. When Trump came out and gave himself credit, the Biden administration wasn't really feeling it, but to their credit, they did give him a little bit of a hat tip here. So the Biden administration wasn't happy with Trump taking full credit, but Biden administration officials, while crediting Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff's contribution during the last phase of the negotiations as crucial to their success, have been careful to say that he was not directly participated in the negotiations. And also a diplomat who was briefed on the ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas credited progress in the talks in part to the influence of Trump, saying that it was the first time there has been real pressure on the Israeli side to accept a deal. There may have been pressure for Israel to accept the deal, but as we now see, they're doing the exact same thing that they have been doing with Biden in power, which is, kind of tentatively agree to a ceasefire deal, lead everyone on, and then in the last minute, boom, pull the rug out from beneath people and say that, no, it turns out there are all sorts of issues and we're going to blame Hamas for this. So that diplomat, by the way, further said that the talks between Israel and Hamas were deadlocked for months and that the contours of the deal, as we learned about them yesterday, made clear that Israel had made some concessions. But again, they've now reversed. And now it appears that this whole ceasefire deal remains in the balance. We don't know if it's actually going to be something Israel ultimately agrees to. Now, the Biden administration has handled this war poorly, to say the least, terribly. And there have been protests at pretty much every press conference Biden administration officials have engaged in. Certainly, Anthony Blinken has been protested multiple times in recent weeks. And so I want to talk a little bit about what happened today when Anthony Blinken decided, you know what, maybe today's a good day to do my farewell speech and give the Biden administration a huge pat on the back for how well they've handled the job. And so let's take a look at the protests that broke out during Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's press conference this morning.
I carried with me.
Miller says he doesn't know about the Hannibal directive.
Again, I'm happy to address questions in just a few more minutes. I look forward to answering questions in a few more minutes. Thank you.
Okay, well, let him speak.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lots of speeches.
Thank you.
Let me answer some questions. Get your hands off me. Get your hands off me. Get your hands off me. Answer a damn question.
I look forward to answering questions in a few minutes.
You know about Israel's nuclear weapons, everybody from the ICJ. I was sitting here quietly and now I'm being manhandled by 2 or 3 people.
So the two people who protested Anthony Blinken during his presser today were Max Blumenthal with the Gray Zone, but also the individual that you heard in the background in that clip. That was an independent journalist by the name of Sam Husseini. And he was, in fact, escorted out by authorities. So was Max Blumenthal. And Ryan Grimm managed to capture some footage of Husseini getting taken out of the room pretty aggressively by multiple people. Now, he was the one, by the way, that you can hear calling out Blinken and saying that he belongs in The Hague. So with that in mind, this is what the scene looked like, off camera. This is the video that was captured by Ryan Grimm. Take a look.
Get your hands off me. Get your hands off me. Get your hands off me. Answer a damn question. Do you know about the Hannibal directive? Do you know about Israel's nuclear weapons? Everybody from the ICJ. I was sitting here quietly and now I'm being manhandled by 2 or 3 people. You pontificate about a free press. You pontificate about a free press. You are hurting me. You are hurting me.
And look, I'm sure there will be some people who will say, well, interrupting Blinken's speech was unacceptable. But think about the evasive nature of the Biden administration when it comes to answering questions from journalists on this very matter. And think about the hypocrisy of the Biden administration when it comes to pretty much everything. But as you can hear, Sam Husseini is specifically calling out the Biden administration for the lack of value toward the free press, especially when it comes to, valuing the free press when they want to ask questions about this very real issue and war, the carnage that American taxpayers are forced to fund. The American government continues to aid and abet. The cover that the Biden administration has provided for the far-right government of Israel as they continue to slaughter tens of thousands of innocent civilians who are trapped in a tiny territory of land called the Gaza Strip. The fact that Israel inched us closer and closer to a potential hot war with Iran. Luckily, that has not happened, but they invaded and went to war in Lebanon. I mean, the situation is already out of control, but it could have been much worse. And honestly, things have felt incredibly out of control with the leadership of the Biden administration. I mean, for the most part, it feels as though Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, is the one making the policy decisions as it pertains to this war. And it's gone on for 15 months. You look at the high death toll among civilians, and it's absolutely, utterly unacceptable. And what you hear from the State Department, what you hear from Anthony Blinken time and time again after Israel has reneged on the ceasefire agreements is that it's Hamas's fault. In other words, he has only regurgitated what Israel says. And it's infuriating. It's absolutely infuriating. One can hold two ideas at the same time. That what Hamas did on October 7th in targeting and slaughtering innocent civilians was grotesque, it was wrong, and there should have been consequences for that. But the response from the Israelis obviously went way too far. And it was more than just retaliation. It was more than just going after Hamas. Clearly, this had more to do with retaliating against the Palestinian people and honestly carrying out some of the genocidal statements that we heard from far-right members of the Israeli government early on in this war. They just flat out said what they planned to do, and then they proceeded to carry it out. Whereas the Biden administration pretended like that wasn't happening. And so I think the journalists are sick of that. And so I'm proud of Sam Husseini for speaking out. The way he was dragged out of that room was disgusting. And it gives you a sense of how, honestly, the Biden administration is full of crap when they talk about the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the freedom of journalists, especially when they're asking legitimate questions that the administration has failed to answer. And if Biden is very concerned about what his legacy is, he should know that his legacy will not be about securing a ceasefire deal between the Israelis and Hamas. His legacy will be about aiding and abetting the slaughter that the Israeli government, along with the Israeli Defense Forces, have carried out in the Gaza Strip, period, point blank. He might want it to be something different. But if he wanted it to be something different, he should have considered maybe using military weaponry as leverage. Instead, Biden gave the Israelis everything they wanted, whenever they wanted it, regardless of how many war crimes the IDF committed, regardless of how much Benjamin Netanyahu humiliated Biden on the international stage. It just is what it is. And so either you want to be a leader or you want to get dog walked by a foreign leader. And in the case of Joe Biden, he got dog walked endlessly. He made his bed. It's time to lay in it.
Look, I know the system feels broken and it's hard to engage with the news right now, but it's not the time to tune out. That's just letting the system go unchecked and unchallenged. We need to know what Trump and the Republican Party are up to, and we need Democrats to understand how they even got here in the first place. That's why I'm working with Ground News. They're an independent app and website that allows you to see through mainstream media narratives and keep both sides in check. For every story, you can swipe to see which news sources are reporting on it, even independent ones left out of the mainstream media bubble, with visual breakdowns of their political bias, credibility, and who's funding the conversation. Compare coverage and reveal essential stories that the left and the right aren't discussing. Take a break from the chaos, but don't check out and let others shape your future. Demand transparency in the leaders who are supposed to serve you and the news to accurately inform you. Go to ground.news/TYT or scan the QR code to take advantage of Ground News' biggest sale of the year. You can save 50% on their top tier Vantage plan, which is what we use, and stay informed without getting overwhelmed by what's going to happen in the next 4 years, because we are the power behind democracy, not just bystanders in a rigged game.